This is frozen today. It's thawing.
He'll get
Last week I forgot it, I had to go get it.
All right, well, you all already got quiet for me, so I feel like I need to start. We've only got, I think, 3 more weeks together, if I've counted right. So you only have to suffer through me for 3 more weeks. I don't know who's teaching next, but we're going to be in 2 Chronicles chapter 5 and 6 today. If you want to be turning over there, and that's lesson 11 in the student companion. If you have a book, 2 Chronicles chapter 5 and 6. So kind of we're going to cover a portion of 2 chapters today. Chapter 5 is focused on, the temple being done. We'll read through that and bring the Ark of the Covenant and placing the things in the temple. And then chapter 6 is focused on Solomon kind of dedicating the temple and the things that he does there. But I thought by way of introduction, we could get started by just talking about what we know or remember about the Ark of the Covenant. Can anybody either describe it to me or mention times that they remember it from the Old Testament or what it was, anything like that? Just a very general question. Okay. Needed people to move it. Was there a specific way they were supposed to move it?
With big poles, and
They
couldn't
needed
touch
to
it.
use poles. What happened to the guy who touched it?
He died.
He died. So there were very specific instructions about how this was to be moved. There were very specific instructions about who was to move the ark. So a lot of things like that. So I think that's important for us to keep in mind. But what did it represent? Like, why did they carry it around?
It's one of the 10 Commandments.
Well, there was stuff in it, right? There was the 10 Commandments and some of the other things that we'll get into. But also, like, as they were moving around, like, it wasn't directly God or anything, but like they would carry it before them and it would lead them into things and things. So it represented at least like somewhat of like God's presence and power and things like that, because we even know when the Philistines took it, which we'll talk about, that they got tired of having it around because just of how powerful it was and stuff, and they gave it back. So we'll get into all that, but I think that's helpful for us to keep in mind. If we want to look at, or I'll just read this since it's shorter, Joshua 3 verses 3 through 4 says, "And commanded the people, as soon as you see the ark of the covenant of the Lord your God being carried by the Levitical priests, then you shall set out from your place and follow it. Yet there shall be a distance between you and it, about 2,000 cubits in length. Do not come near it, in order that you may know the way you shall go, for you have not passed this way before." So like as they were moving out of Exodus and going into the lands that they were supposed to go to, they were following it. And has very important historical significance to the Israelites. Does anybody know where it's being kept at this point, before the temple is finished, or I guess that we'll be talking about here? In the tabernacle is where it's at right now, which is like what the transition that we're looking at is from the tabernacle, that they had been using to worship the temple and the grandeur that it is today. So we'll kind of keep those thoughts in mind as we get going this morning. If somebody wants to read 2 Chronicles 5, verses 1 through 10, that's the first passage we'll be looking at. 2 Chronicles 5, 1 through 10.
So all the work that Solomon had done for the house of the Lord was finished, and Solomon brought in the things which his father David had dedicated, the silver and the gold and all the furnishings, and he put them in the treasures of the house of God. Now Solomon assembled the elders of Israel and all the heads of the tribes, the chief fathers of the children of Israel, in Jerusalem, that they might bring the ark of the covenant of the Lord up from the city of David, which is Zion. Therefore all the men of Israel assembled with the king at the feast, which was in the 7th month. So all the elders of Israel came, and the Levites took up the ark. Then they brought up the ark, the tabernacle of meeting, and all the holy furnishings that were in the tabernacle. The priests and the Levites brought them up. Also King Solomon and all the congregation of Israel who were assembled with them before the ark were sacrificing sheep and oxen that could not be counted or numbered for multitude. Then the priests brought in the ark of the covenant of the Lord to its place into the inner sanctuary of the temple, to the most holy place, under the wings of the cherubim. For the cherubim spread their wings over the place of the ark, and the cherubim overshadowed the ark and its poles. The poles extended so that the ends of the poles of the ark could be seen from the holy place in front of the inner sanctuary, but they could not be seen from the inside, and they are there to this day. Nothing was in the ark except the 2 tablets which Moses put there in Horeb, when the Lord made a covenant with the children of Israel when they had come out of Egypt.
All right, thank you. So I think the first thing that we see here in verse 1, right to kick us off, and I alluded to this last week, is like we talked about how Solomon last week was preparing to get the temple built, and then here we see, with the help of a lot of other people, he actually finishes it. So I think this is important, you know, as we think about like things that we take on in the church or that we work on to like, you know, remember what we talked about last week of like, it's good to set a plan, it's good to understand what God's will is for you and make sure that you're working towards that, but we also want to like have milestones and make sure we achieve those things and reach those things so that we can see that the temple was completed here in verse 1. And then just thinking about this to try to put it in perspective for us, and you know, at least the best that I could understand. So they finished the temple, the house of the Lord. What happens either when you finish, if you've ever built your own house or you buy a new house? What's like after you've closed and it's officially yours? What's like the next thing you do? You've inspected, the bones of the house are good and stuff, but you bought it, it's yours. What's the next thing that happens?
Move in.
You move into it, right? Does anybody enjoy moving? If you do, let me know. So the next time I do it, you can be there to help me. What's hard about moving?
Everything.
Figuring out where things go.
You've got all this stuff that you've accumulated all over life, right? And you've moved it from place to place. And at least for me and Shelby, we always realize every time we move how much stuff we've kept that we no longer actually need, but we continue to carry it around. And we're always like, when we move, this is our time to downsize. And then we never do. We just get a bigger U-Haul or whatever and bring it all with us. And then you carried that all along, which isn't a perfect parallel because, you know, this stuff is valuable that they're bringing. But you've got to remember, like, all of these things that David had set aside and all the important things that they had either built recently or, you know, like we've talked about, like the Ark of the Covenant or some of the different historical things that they had to bring all of this in. And I don't think that they had like a used storage facility or something, you know, outside the city that they could just be like, oh, we've kept all our stuff in here and these guys are going to bring it in, right? Like they had specific things that they had to follow. And then if we think about the valuable stuff we have that's larger, even as we, you know, had mentioned, they had to carry the Ark of the Covenant in specifically. What happens if you have something that's huge and made of glass and you don't think about how you're going to carry it? Like you're probably, I have specifically been helping people move and we didn't pack stuff well enough and we shattered something that was glass because there are very specific ways and you kind of have to think through things. And so I think kind of, you know, clearly it's not the exact same thing. There were a lot of things that they had to handle and a lot of things that they had to do. But I think we can kind of relate to how stressful, but also you're very excited, right? Like hopefully, you know, if you're moving for hopefully a good reason, like you're in a new place, you've got all these things you want to set up, and so you're excited about this as well. And so that's, going through both Solomon's mind as they've completed the building of the temple, all the people, all the Israelites, they're very excited about this. And then, this is also like they've been operating out of like temporary stuff for so long, and now like they've started to have like more permanent building. They've got the more permanent temple for God. They've got Solomon's house that's being built. They've got the walls that are being built. So it's also exciting for God's people, because there's all these like permanent structures. We can build things up. We can do this. So I think that's interesting for us to keep in mind as we continue through here, all the things that were being brought in. Then as we move on to verses 2 through 4, kind of looking at what happens here, Solomon assembles all the leaders of Israel, all the elders, the fathers' houses of the people of Israel, and they were also there for the feast in the 7th month, probably the Feast of the Tabernacles. Why do you think Solomon assembled all of these leaders and all of these men together for this event?
I mean, ceremonial purposes.
Right.
Want all the official people to be there, just so it feels complete.
Right. So, like, just from pure ceremony, I think that's important. Like if you're planning something like this and none of the important people show up, it kind of deflates a little bit of the ceremony that's going on. Why else would it have been, something he might have brought all these leaders here for?
Be a lot of logistics.
Yeah.
Stuff in.
Yep, there's a lot of logistical things. He needed if you have all the leaders there, and you're going to need the Levites to bring in the Ark of the Covenant, you're going to need specific people to do certain things, then it's easier to kind of, to the point we were making last week, it's hard to just talk to 200,000 people standing up on something or whatever. So, I think that's a good point. Any other thoughts? Like, what came to mind for me was just that, you also want people to witness this. This is going to be a huge event for, God's children, right? And so, and they can't just go film it like we can today. And we still will travel for ceremonious events that we want to be a part of, right? Because there's just something about being there, but they can't film it. So for it to be documented and for people to understand how magnificent this was, you wanted as many people to be there as possible, so they could take it all in and talk to people about it. So I think that's, interesting, another interesting thing that went on here, but was, to the flip side of that, this also wasn't just about the ceremony, right? This was, God had asked Solomon to do this very specifically, and this was going to be the dwelling place where people went to worship God, where people interacted with God, and so that was the huge significance of the temple being built as well. And I think it's helpful for people to be there to understand that. So then, if we keep going in kind of through the rest of it. We already hit on the fact that there were some very specific rules for carrying the Ark of the Covenant, right? In verse 5, it says, "And they brought up the Ark, the tent of meeting, and all the holy vessels that were up into the tent. And the Levitical priests brought them up." And again, this reminds us that, the Levites were the ones that were supposed to bring the ark. This has not been followed in the past, and certain people have died because rules haven't been followed. The ark has been captured because not direct rules have been broken, but indirectly, the Israelites weren't doing what God wanted. And so, we see Solomon here, at least right now, doing what he's supposed to, following all the rules, because he wants to make sure that everything goes exactly right. But also, this goes back to something we've hit on before when we were talking about the builders last week. The Levites had specific priestly roles, right? And they were different and worked on different things than people from the other tribes. And so that's important for us to remember today is, when we come together to do something as a church or as Christians across the world, we each have a different part that we play, but all of them are very important. And so we need to be ready. The Levites couldn't have just been sitting around and not understand all of these rules, but they hadn't moved the ark in theory in a while. So it's important for us to be ready for the roles that we need to play. And we already, like I said, hit on some of the specific rules. We see that the ark is going to be placed in the most holy place underneath the wings of the cherubim. And then kind of we move on to verses 8, 9, and 10, where it just, the Bible continues to describe how magnificent this event will be. We see some specific language talking about how the cherubim spread out their wings over the place of the ark, so that the cherubim made a covering above the ark and its poles. And the poles were so long that the ends of the poles were seen from the holy place before the inner sanctuary. And unfortunately, I tend to struggle, even though I work with computers, on doing PowerPoint while I'm teaching, so I didn't put anything together. But I would encourage you, when you get home, to go look up some pictures of the temple and how it was laid out, with the kind of different layers and levels. But this would mean, there was like the central most holy place, and the poles were sticking out into the inner sanctuary, and just like to represent again how magnificent this is and how great this, the ark is, and just this event overall. So I think that's important. And then like in verse 10, the last part of this passage is just, I think there's two important points here. One, it kind of hits on the fact that we have things in the ark all the way back from Moses, the 2 tablets, the 10 commandments that were put in place. But is there anything missing from the ark? Yeah.
The rod of Aaron that budded and
Yeah.
the pot of showbread, or
Right.
of manna.
Yeah.
It's missing. So somewhere over the years,
Yeah.
those two have been taken.
Anybody have, I don't think we're directly told, anybody have thoughts on what might have happened to the other 2 things?
They've been captured by enemies a couple of times and spent time out of the sanctuary. It wasn't in the tabernacles all
Yeah.
that time. So
And if I pick the things I'm going to steal, if I'm an opposing nation, I probably want the things that I think are like powerful or helpful, versus like if I have those 2 items you mentioned and then I have the law, I'm like, do I want this law from this other nation, right? Or do I want these other things that, like, in theory might help me with whatever? We don't know what happened to them, but I thought that was interesting to think about, like, why did they leave the 10 Commandments and then the other things are missing, So that's interesting for us to keep in mind too. But it also, like, this all represents that back from, like, thinking as far back as to when the Israelites were in Egypt under captivity to now, God has been promising, I'm going to take care of you. I'm going to get you to the point you're supposed to be of prominence. And then it's interesting too that parallels with us today, because was that really the end of God's plan, that it was just like Solomon and the kings were going to rule and be in charge? No, it was that, like, Jesus was going to come, he's going to die for us so that we can spend eternity in heaven. So, like, we'll hopefully have some time to draw some parallels between the temple and the church today, if we get there. But anyway, any thoughts before we move on to the next? Yeah.
So I just have to back up. So cherubim, aren't they angels? So are they like real angels, or are these like cement angels, or
So they
stone
were
ones?
like carved and like golden and like sticking their wings and
So they
appendages out.
move their wings? So these things are moving?
No. So
Okay.
Like it's 2
Kind of sparkly.
statues and the wings are like facing each other and they're
Okay.
like on top. So it literally
They're
kind of
just
covers the
describing.
lid of,
Okay.
of the ark.
Okay.
Yeah.
I thought they were moving. I thought,
No.
that's
That'd be pretty cool.
Okay.
yeah. Yeah.
I thought it was interesting to mention the tabernacle here, because I had just assumed over the years the tabernacle had kind of disappeared. But
Yeah.
here it reappears, so it had been somewhere without the Ark of the Covenant. in it.
Right.
So
Yeah, and I was trying to like dig in on that because I hadn't realized that either until I was studying for this class, and I like, because there's a mention of it like coming from the city of David, which is Zion, in verse 2, but like I was still struggling because I was trying to just like Google like where did they actually bring it from in 2, and didn't find like very specific things, but like you're saying, it wasn't like, oh, this just got lost in the shuffle. It was somewhere, and in theory, they've been yeah. Any other thoughts?
Now she's got me thinking, was there a vision for that design? Like, how did they know to use cherubim?
Yeah, there was a lot of, which unfortunately we like skipped over these
Oh.
couple of chapters just because it's a lot of the detail. But if you go look at chapters, like we went from chapter 2 to chapter 5 and just skipped over how did it all get done.
Okay.
And so there's like various verses, throughout there that like give some of the specification of like how things were built. I think a lot of that's in chapter 4, but yeah, they talk about a lot of that stuff. And that's how we like, when you'll see people like make renderings of what it looked like today, that's some of the value of having like it was this many cubits and this many things, is we can do some recreation of probably what it looked like. Yeah.
And some of those instructions had been actually given to Moses, and they've
Yeah.
done it back to us. The
Right.
descriptions are pretty detailed.
Yeah, because we get, Baxter's been covering on Wednesday night, like you've gotten the dimensions of like how we're going to build the Ark of the Covenant when it was originally built. There were a lot of dimensions for the tabernacle. There were dimensions for the temple. Like God didn't just say like, go figure this out yourselves. Like he wanted a specific thing, like even as far back as, Noah, he gave very specific instructions on how to build the Ark then so that it survived and served its purpose. So, I think that's interesting for us to keep in mind as well. Any other thoughts? All right. If not, let's read the next passage, which is 2 Chronicles 5, starting in verse 11, and then through chapter 6, verse 2. If somebody wants to read that for me.
And it came to pass, when the priests came out of the most holy place, for all the priests who were present had sanctified themselves without keeping to their divisions. And the Levites, who were the singers, all those of Asaph and Heman and Jeduthun, with their sons and brethren, stood at the east end of the altar, clothed in white linen, having cymbals, stringed instruments, and harps, and with them 123 sounded the trumpets. Indeed, it came to pass, when the trumpeters and singers were as one, to make one sound to be heard in praising and thanking the Lord. And when they lifted up their voice with the trumpets and cymbals and instruments of music, and praised the Lord, saying, For he is good, for his mercy endures forever. That the house of the Lord, was filled with a cloud, so that the priests could not continue ministering because of the cloud. The glory of the Lord filled with the house of God. Then Solomon spoke. The Lord said, He would dwell in the dark cloud. I have surely built you an exalted house, and a place for you to dwell in forever.
All right, thank you. You took the hard names on that one too. Okay, so what I thought was interesting, first of all, is we see in verse 11 and following, like the priests come out of the holy place and they had come together, setting themselves apart to do this, but they didn't give regard to their divisions, which I thought was an interesting thing just for us to keep in mind, is that like sometimes when we're called to do things, whether we're like separated for a specific purpose or, we've made those separations ourselves, there are going to be times that we need to come together. We need to make sure we're working together for God's glory. So I just thought that was an interesting thing that it called out kind of in parentheses in my version, but just still something to keep in mind. But then I wanted to focus on how are they actually like celebrating that this is done, and what do they do to praise God? Like in verses 12 and following through chapter 5. They sang.
And they played instruments.
They played instruments, right? So they were, and the point I wanted to make here is like, it's okay to be like excited and passionate when God does something for us, to like praise Him and be thankful for that, because I feel like sometimes, we're so focused, and it's good for us to be focused on how we're supposed to worship and how we're supposed to praise God specifically, because we are given instruction in the New Testament. But sometimes I feel like we focus so much on that we don't focus on like our hearts being in the right place to praise God and like being, this excited. Like there are times when God does things in our life before this church or different things, and it's like okay to be overwhelmed with joy and for that to come out when we're singing or when we're talking to people or doing various things. So I think that that's important for us to keep in mind, but also that there are like specific ways that we are supposed to go about doing that aren't exactly the same as what's called out here. But I thought that was interesting, as we read through that, how excited they were in praising of God, and that like we should be doing that when, good things happen. Because sometimes I think it's easy to focus on, there's a balance between like when things are going rough for us too, and like talking to God and still praising Him. But I think for me personally, it's honestly easier in the good times for me not to think about like how much God has done for me, or and be praising Him appropriately. So I think that's important for us to keep in mind. So we have that, and we have the example of how they praised God for this. And then I thought it was interesting to call out, just for us to think about what this would have been like in verses 13 and 14, where it says the house of the Lord was filled with a cloud. And so if we pause there for a second and just think about like, how would we react today if like there was just this thick cloud, that came over the church right now? I mean, I could see us feeling all sorts of things. How would you all feel if that happened today?
I think the water line burst.
Yeah, exactly. We'd be like, what's going on here, or whatever. And then if we go down into verse 14, it says, so that the priest could not stand to minister because of the cloud, for the glory of the Lord filled the house of God. I just want us to think about that for a second. It's not like just some thick fog when we're driving in that like, okay, I can still like see to drive through or whatever. Like it was so thick that like I wouldn't be able to be up here like teaching the class or like Caleb singing later or whatever. It was like that thick that they couldn't even do what they were there to perform. And I think that that's just important for us to recognize that point, like as far as just the glory of God and how great that He is, that like if He just shows us all of His glory, like it's so powerful that we like can't even do anything in the moment. So I think that's important, for us to recognize from this passage as well. Before we flip over to chapter 6 to cover those verses, any thoughts on that? Yeah.
Just from a music perspective, purely secular point of view, the idea of 120 people specifically playing trumpet.
Mm-hmm.
Back when I was in like my school's like wind ensemble and orchestra and things like that, we had a section of 10 trumpets. And the running joke was that is an obnoxious amount of trumpets. That 10 trumpets, even playing different parts, is just so overwhelming and like pushes through the rest of the music. 120 trumpets and people singing at the same time, that would be something to witness.
Yeah.
Like this was not just your local town gathering, like community orchestra type thing. Going back to like the whole ceremony and like the coming togetherness of it, that is like the sound you wouldn't be able to hear. I wouldn't be able to talk to Carrie. Like she would not be able to hear me. How incredibly overwhelming just the uplifting of praise would be.
And like that moves you like as a person to like be involved in that, right? Like they're gonna, hopefully everyone will come out of this very excited for God, and just be thinking about how great He is after this event.
It said, when the trumpeters and the singers were as one to make one sound be heard in praising and thanking the Lord, they lifted up their voices. And it was after they proclaimed, for He is good and His mercy endures forever, that the house of the Lord was filled with a cloud.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
It's sort of like when we have the seminars at the different places around, and there's 5,000 or 10,000 of us all gathered there.
Yeah.
And the singing and all of that is just, it's just uplifting. It's just overpowering. Your heart's just so different than, it should be the same here, but it's just different with that many people. And you look around and we're all doing the same thing.
Yeah, yes, and I think that's a really good point of like when you can see so many Christians together in unity, and like even if we're not like, the good chance is the way things are designed, we're like actually all not that good at singing, right? Like, but we are like singing together and we're edifying one another, and that can be so encouraging. And it's like, like it's very different if I pull out Spotify to listen to a song versus like going to a concert where like you're there with like all of those people. And I think the reason is like music has that ability to uplift us, and like God knows that He designed us, and so like there's a reason that we get together to sing together because it's encouraging.
I just have to uplift Patsy having the soup, sip, and slurp, or whatever order that is. That I've only been a part of that 1 year, but just there's something about people coming together, yes, to have food, but also just to sing, not in a context of this kind of leads into the sermon, and this isn't to put down any kind of like official worship singing, but just coming together to be together and singing. Like you said, it's not necessarily even about singing correctly, about having the right harmonies and singing the right melodies, but like just having people there just wanting to sing is, you know, it's, you feel that unity, and it feels just like the voices are going straight up to heaven in a certain way.
You know, I just think that's like such a powerful thing that's hard for us to even capture. But I encourage you all as we're singing later today to just be like thinking about that and like feeling, you know, that praise towards God and like have your heart into it. Just, I can't describe it. You can only experience it. Yeah.
I think the words that we say too, they were proclaiming the truth and proclaiming the truth of that He is good. And the words that we sing in the hymns, when we proclaim that all together as one, is powerful and good.
Yeah, and that's a really good point of like, it also, for it to be praised to God, I can't just be singing like a, you know, row, row, row your boat or something, you know, like the words are important too, because that is our praise to God, and like we can get into that in chapter 6 as far as like how Solomon starts out with his praise to God, but like just recognizing who God is, how powerful He is, what all He's done for us, that's an important part of our praise, and that we're like singing that and directing it to Him. So, all really good thoughts. Yeah.
I think we're supposed to rightly divide the word, and so as we read this, we have to do it in context. Because there's a lot of churches around here that will read this and say, see, we can accompany our singing with all kinds of instruments.
Yep. Yeah, and I think that's where like we have to look at a lot of the things even in this passage, right? Like in verse, of course I'm not going to be able to find it now. In one of the earlier verses, they talked about as they were going, they were sacrificing sheep and oxen as they went to praise God, and there are parallels between what they did back then and what we do now, but clearly we're not doing all of the things that they did. We are not walking with an ark, you know, out in front of us as we're like trying to figure out how to get to church or something like that. So there are a lot of differences, and we have to understand what was specific for this time versus what we are asked to do today. So I think that's a good point as well. Any thoughts? All right, if not, we'll turn over and cover those 2 verses in chapter 6. So turn over with me to 2 Chronicles 6, and we'll finish out 1 and 2, and then read the last chunk. So we see here in verse 1, you know, that Solomon said, the Lord has said that He will dwell in thick darkness, but I've built you an exalted house, a place for you to dwell forever. And this is just like Solomon getting ready to, you know, talk to the people, you know, blessing them, exalting God. But this is him saying, like, I've done what I was supposed to do so that the Lord has an exalted house. But I thought the thing that was interesting was that, like, is the temple the place that God is going to dwell forever? Like, we're you know, 2,000, 3,000 years removed. Like, where does God dwell? Is it the Four Lakes Church of Christ building? No, like this is not. It's in. I think I heard you say it's like in us, in our hearts. You know, that we are, and that doesn't mean like we have control over God, just like the temple. It wasn't like they built the temple and He was just, this cloud was Him getting sucked in and He's like bound there. Like, that's not the point. It represented a place that people could go to talk to God, or that the priest could go to make sacrifices to God, but it wasn't bounding God to that specific place, just like He's not like bound to my heart specifically. But if we serve Him and do what we're supposed to, the church is that temple today. So, you know, and not in all the exact same ways, but that is how, you know, God is seen throughout us. Any other thoughts before we read the last passage together?
Well, that God, since He dwells in the clouds, which actually covered the earth,
Mm-hmm.
which actually He created all that, so He's everywhere.
Yeah, He's everywhere, and it's not something that like we can even fathom, right? Like a lot of times, like God will help us to understand with things, maybe like the temple, or with, you know, parables that we see in the New Testament, or different things to try to understand like His presence and where He is. But like we just can only put it in human terms because that's what we've experienced. So like we can read all these things and see all these things, and we still have to understand that's just like the best way he's able to convey it to us to try to get us to understand. So, all right, let's read the last section, 2 Chronicles chapter 6, verses 3 through 11, and I'll go ahead and read that just for the sake of time. 2 Chronicles chapter 6, verses 3 through 11. And it says, "Then the king turned around and blessed all the assembly of Israel, while all the assembly of Israel stood. And he said, Blessed be the God of Israel, who with his hand has fulfilled what he promised with his mouth to David my father, saying, Since the day that I brought my people out of the land of Egypt, I chose no city out of all the tribes of Israel in which to build a house, that my name might be there. And I chose no man as prince over my people Israel, but I have chosen Jerusalem, that my name may be there, and I have chosen David to be over my people Israel. Now it was in the heart of David, my father, to build a house for the name of the Lord, the God of Israel. But the Lord said to David, my father, Whereas it was in your heart to build a house for my name, you did well that it was in your heart. Nevertheless, it is not you who shall build the house, but your son, who shall be born to you, shall build the house for my name. Now the Lord has fulfilled his promise that he made, for I have risen in the place of David my father, and sit on the throne of Israel, as the Lord promised, and I have built the house for the name of the Lord, the God of Israel. And there I have set the ark, in which is the covenant of the Lord that he made with the people of Israel." So there's a lot, that we can potentially unpack here. So, we have Solomon saying what he said that we already covered, and then he turns around and blesses, all the assembly of Israel. And I think we talked about this kind of when he was praying for wisdom a couple chapters ago. How does he start his prayer, or like this blessing that he's giving, I guess? In verse 4, what's it focused on right out of the gate? God. He's saying, Blessed be the Lord, the God of Israel. And he goes on to say, here's all these things that I recognize that you've done for me and for your people. And I still think, again, like I said before, every prayer we say doesn't have to be like this, but I think it's a good model to follow when we're talking about either to God or about what God's done for us, is to think about like all the great things he's done for us, to like praise him first before we get into maybe asking what we want of him or things like that. Just the humility to come before God and, recognize what all he's done. So we see that. And then I think another interesting point is like, if we think back to Exodus, like how confident were the people about leaving Egyptian bondage? A lot of them were like, especially after, maybe like while it was going on, all the plagues were happening, I'm like, okay, yeah, this is going to happen. And then they get out in the wilderness and they're like, we'd be better off if we were back in Egypt, right? And I think the thing that I wanted us to recognize here is that like God had a plan. Was it a 1-year plan that they were just going to like leave and go have this temple built? No, this took hundreds of years to accomplish. Some because of how the Israelites acted, but like it took a long time to come to fruition. And so, but I think it's an important call out here, because while God created us and we owe him so much for that, is it just God's done that and like he's left us to be, and when he makes promises we don't know if they're going to happen or not? No, like when he promises these things, we can see the example of when he made promises when they were leaving Egypt, and those were fulfilled. So by virtue of that, when he makes promises to us, we know that he is truth. He is not lying to us, that we can depend that those promises are going to be upheld. So I think that's, an important thing that we can get out of like reading through these verses, is that, if I was somebody leaving Egypt and I'm like, I know the general direction we're going, but I don't know this whole plan that's going to come out and like, exactly what's going to happen with David and all these things. Like, I could see how it'd be very hard for them to trust God and do all the things that they should. But I think that's why we have all these lessons to look back on. That's why we have the Old Testament. We can go and study it and understand, is so that we can try, to trust God, and we can try to trust Him through those hard times, because it can be difficult when we don't know what all is going on. So I think that's important for us to keep in mind. And then we see again, kind of reading down through those verses, how it keeps coming up how like David really wanted to build the temple. He was a man after God's own heart, but that wasn't like his thing that he was supposed to do, right? We talked in previous classes about why it wasn't for David to build the temple, but he still did his part to get everything as prepared as he could for Solomon, his son, to go and do the Lord's work. And just as a reminder, like that's important for us. We might not be the one doing the thing that we think is like the grandeur or like grandiose thing for God, but we might be preparing the way or helping support someone who is, and that's just as important for us to like help, in any way we can to serve God. And then let's see. Well, I'll pause there for questions while I get my brain together. Any thoughts on it? Yeah.
I think that's why it tells us one of the virtues is to be patient. And so many times we want things like that because we are living in an instant type, society now. And you have to set back sometimes, and when you're asking God for things to set back and say, okay, I have to leave it with you, try to help me be patient, because that's one thing I know I have a hard time with. So
right, yeah, and I think for the reason you mentioned, it's hard for probably a lot, if not all of us, right? Is because I'm so used to, I can pull up a website and like order food, and so I'm mad if somebody doesn't get it to me in 30 minutes if I've ordered something to my house or whatever, and it's like we're talking on the magnitude of years or centuries that, it might even happen in their lifetime as far as like the things that they're having to trust that they're like building towards. And so I think that's important. How do we put that into practice? How do we learn that patience? Yeah.
I think one key thing is when we're trying to reach those that are lost, especially loved ones.
Mm-hmm.
And we can really want results. Plant the seed, water the seed, watch it grow, and eat the fruit in 45 minutes. But there's a high likelihood that that will not happen.
Right.
And it may not be us that actually helps them to the final knowledge of the salvation of the truth, but it could be that we are doing things to help prepare the way.
Right. Yeah. Juanita.
I remember years ago, our middle son had been a problem, put it that way. And I said to my husband, why didn't God give him to somebody that has patience? And he looked at me and smiled, and he said, did you ever think maybe he gave him to you to teach you patience?
Yeah. I mean, that's how it works a lot of the time, right? It's like that's how we get patience by being put in situations that make us wish we had more patience a lot of times. That's how we learn, and that's how we deal with it. And for me personally, I think, sometimes it helps if I can like look back on things in my life where it's like, more apparent to me, like clearly, God helped me here. He had a hand in this in some way. Like, I don't know that he directly did X, Y, and Z, but like, I prayed to him back then. Maybe I didn't realize what was going on in the moment, but like things worked out for me, and I have that trust. And I think that's, the overall point that I wanted to make here is that like we can look to the past to help us feel more confident that he's going to do, what he said, and like look just around us and how he takes care of us, right? There's so many verses throughout the Old and the New Testament talking about like, do the birds of the air worry about where they're going to get their food? Like, no, they know that like it's going to be there, and we just have to learn to have, a similar attitude and trust in God. Yeah.
Trust in God, knowing that he is almighty God and all-knowing. Sometimes the answer that he gives us, he knows the reason why. It's not usually the answer, it can be the answer that, not the one we want to hear.
Right. Yeah. And I think that's an interesting thing you bring up is like, I trust Shelby a whole lot, right? But like she's not all powerful as far as God is. So like if she promises me that, she's going to make a car appear out there for me or whatever, like I'm not going to trust that, because like I know she doesn't have the capability to do that, even though like I trust her as a person, right? And I hadn't even thought of that, but like that's a good point about like we also know and see examples of how powerful God is, so we know He's capable of doing these things that He promised to us as well. So like, yeah, Caleb.
And I think something we have to keep in mind is that God's help is not always going to come from the church.
Yep.
And take that how I mean it. That might sound a little weird at first. We're like, if we need support, if we need uplifting, it's not always going to be someone we know from our church or from another nearby church that's going to give that to us.
Right.
And so in that way, we have to keep in mind we can't push away any help that isn't from a Christian source.
Yeah.
In the same way how Juanita talked about, well, why did they give me this kid? Maybe that's to teach patience. In the same way, maybe the Lord is sending you help from not the church to remind you there is value in people just because they don't agree with you, just because they don't walk the same path that you do, doesn't mean that they can't help you.
Right. And like that.
We can learn lessons from writings that are outside the Bible. Just because something is not biblically canon doesn't mean it has no value to be learned from.
But like what you were talking about even made me think of like the Good Samaritan, right? Like that whole thing is about like, oh, you know, you would expect all these other people who should have been helping to be the ones helping, and it was the Samaritan that people looked down on that was the one that actually did what was needed. So yeah, I think like, you know, we talked about there's a lot of good things that we can learn from what we looked through as far as just like generally our attitude towards God and what we recognize that He's done for us, and just making sure that we like understand what we're supposed to do to like show our thankfulness and praise back to Him. So a lot of good thoughts. All right, yep.
So one last question about Jerusalem. So why did God choose that area? Because I have yet to recognize the time frame where it was actually peaceful there. I mean, why did He choose that spot?
Well, I think some of it is because of Him choosing that spot that it's not peaceful, like even today, right? Is like people arguing over that. I don't know if I have a like great answer as far as like why did He choose that as like the ultimate spot. Yeah.
I think it's a really good example of how God doesn't promise us peace on earth.
Yeah, that's true too.
You know, we can't expect, like, just because we're Christians or just because we try, no one actually ever does everything right, but we try to do everything right, that you're just going to get riches and peace and, you know, whatever here.
Yep. It is very easy for us to be so focused on like what's in the world here and now, and thinking that like because I'm a Christian, like I'm doing all these things, like my life should be good. And generally some of the principles we find in the Bible will help us to have more peace, but that's within ourselves, not externally. There may be a lot of pressures or conflict, whether it's families or actual like war, like all sorts of things that can be going on. We're not promised anything from that perspective while we're here on this earth, but we can have peace within ourselves when we learn to trust God. And I think that's, you know, the point there. All right, well, I think we're a little bit over, so we'll go ahead and close for class and get ready for worship. Thanks, everybody.